Let's get one thing straight. The United States is not a Christian nation. Not legally, not constitutionally, and frankly, not culturally in the way that Christian nationalists mean when they make arguments otherwise. And what follows here is not merely an assertion that Christian nationalists are wrong, it is a detailed explanation of why they're wrong, historically, philosophically, and constitutionally. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. I'm making this video in part because of the debate that unfolded on Capitol Hill over the last few days between Christian nationalists and Congressman Jamie Raskin, who incidentally was a constitutional law professor at my law school while I was there. I'm also making it in response to this supposed rededication ceremony that's going to be occurring on the National Mall this weekend. One of the things that's become very clear watching the debates on the Hill is that Christian nationalists routinely misrepresent both the history and the philosophical underpinnings of the United States and its foundational document. They'll say something akin to, the founders mentioned God, therefore America is a Christian nation. But that doesn't logically follow. So first, the Declaration of Independence was not and is not the governing charter of the United States. The Declaration of Independence is actually the most famous breakup letter in human history. We wrote it to explain why the American colonies were severing their political relationship with England. And like most breakup letters, it's written in the language of the relationship that existed prior to the breakup. The colonies were English colonies. We were speaking to Englishmen. The colonies were rooted in English political traditions. And England was explicitly a Christian nation with a very close relationship between its state church and political authority. At the time of the American Revolution, the consequences of the English Reformation were still very fresh in the minds of the founding generation. The split between the Church of England and the Catholic Church had fundamentally reshaped English politics and the English concepts of sovereignty, and not always in good ways. It was violent. So, yes, the course of the Declaration reflects some of that intellectual and philosophical background. But as with any ending relationship, the more important question was this: what happens next? Because when the founders sat down to create the actual governing framework of the United States, they moved decisively away from the European model where religious authority and political authority influence one another. That was very much on purpose. And that distinction is critical. The Constitution contains no established national religion, no reference to Christianity, no reference to Jesus Christ, no biblical qualification for office, no religious test for citizenship, and an explicit prohibition on religious establishment through the First Amendment. That was not accidental. That was the point. And honestly, saying that the United States is fundamentally Christian because the Declaration of Independence mentions God has about the same logical flavor as saying you should define the terms of your marriage by the language of your divorce decree with your ex-wife. That's not what that document's for. The Declaration was explaining why the colonies were leaving England. The Constitution was defining what the United States was going to become next. And what the United States became was a constitutional system specifically designed to prevent religious authority from exercising control over public life. Now, to be fair, the natural rights philosophy woven into the Declaration absolutely does come from John Locke. At this point, that is historically almost indisputable. Thomas Jefferson was very clearly borrowing from Locke's second treatise on government when he drafted the Declaration. The natural rights framework within the Declaration is unmistakably Lockean. Human rights, human equality, inalienable rights, government by consent, and the rejection of hereditary political authority. But this is where Christian nationalists start to get sloppy. John Locke was neither a purely secular Enlightenment thinker nor a Christian theologian. Neither. He was a Protestant philosopher working within the broader Enlightenment framework that tried to ground political legitimacy in reason and natural law rather than specifically ecclesiastical authority. And that distinction matters enormously. There's little room for doubt that Locke believed in God. He almost certainly believed in God deeply. In fact, Locke grounded natural rights in the existence of a creator. His argument was essentially that human beings possess inherent dignity and equality because they are created by God, and therefore no king or government possesses absolute authority over them. But in no way does that mean that Locke was arguing for a specifically Christian government. He was arguing against divine right monarchy, against inherited political hierarchy, against the idea that rulers possessed authority because God personally selected them to rule over everyone else. And this is where the irony in the Christian nationalist argument becomes impossible to ignore. Because one of Locke's central principles was this: because all humans are the creation of God, none of us possess inherent dominion over one another. That principle applies as much philosophically as it does personally. If all people are equal before God, then no king possesses automatic authority over the population. But in the exact same way, no church possesses the automatic sovereignty over people's conscience. And no individual possesses the inherent right to force another person into ideological or theological conformity. That is the entire moral foundation of Locke's rejection of divine right monarchy. And there's no shortage of irony in the fact that that is the exact principle Christian nationalists seem to reject. Because to claim that the United States should be fundamentally governed by Christianity, or that Christianity should possess privileged authority over public life, is ultimately to claim that one group of people possesses the right to impose its theological framework on everyone else through the machinery of the state. That is precisely the kind of religious and political hierarchy the Enlightenment and the American constitutional system that emerged from it was designed to dismantle. And Thomas Jefferson himself becomes incredibly important here. Jefferson was very clearly influenced by Locke, but Jefferson was by no means an Orthodox Christian in the traditional sense. Now, to be precise, it's probably not fair to call Jefferson an atheist. To use modern terminology is probably more agnostic. There is substantial evidence that Jefferson believed in some kind of creator or higher intelligence. But Jefferson was deeply skeptical of organized Christianity and many core doctrines of Orthodox Christian theology. He explicitly rejected the idea of a Trinity. He rejected the idea of miracles. He rejected large portions of supernatural Christianity altogether. In fact, Jefferson famously created what is now called the Jefferson Bible, where he literally cut the miraculous and supernatural elements out of the New Testament and retained primarily the moral teachings of Jesus. That is clearly not Orthodox Christianity. At a minimum, Jefferson was operating much closer to Enlightenment deism or a highly rationalized form of Christianity than anything modern Christian nationalists would recognize as theological orthodoxy. That context matters because when Jefferson references a creator in the Declaration of Independence, modern Christian nationalists often smuggle in assumptions that Jefferson himself very likely did not hold. They hear, or at least promote, the God of modern evangelical Protestant Christianity. But the intellectual world that the founding generation lived in was much more complicated than that. The founders themselves included Orthodox Christians, Unitarians, deists, skeptics, strict rationalists, and men whose theology would probably be denounced as heretical by many modern Christian nationalists today. So no, the United States is not a Christian nation. It is explicitly not a Christian nation. In many respects, it's the exact opposite. The United States is a specific rejection of the old European model where religious authority and political authority were fused together. The entire constitutional structure of the United States was designed to ensure that people with radically different religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, and moral convictions could coexist without any one faction claiming sovereign authority over the consciousness of everyone else. That is why the sovereignty of the United States flows from the phrase, we the people, not from church authority, not from theology, not from religious identity, and not from claims of divine political entitlement. And that distinction is one of the most important constitutional innovations in modern history. It very likely will remain the most enduring legacy of the United States long after the United States itself has failed. So keep all this in mind this weekend as you watch a bunch of Trump supporters and Christian nationalists gathering on the National Mall, attempting to symbolically rededicate the United States to Christianity. Because what they're actually advocating for is not a return to the American ideals. It's a rejection of them.